Excellent. So today we're going to be going over Know Your Water. It's going to be a nitrate awareness workshop. We have 4 speakers lined up to kind of talk to you about nitrates in St. Croix County. I'll start it off by going over what nitrates, the status of nitrates in the county right now. I'll pass it off to Genevieve Palazzolo, and she's with Public Health, and she's going to talk about the health implications of nitrates. Cayla Cavey is the Groundwater Specialist at UW-Stevens Point. She'll be talking about testing and treatment options. And then Tim Stieber, he's our Land and Water Conservation Administrator. He's going to talk about what we're doing about nitrates, how we tackle these high nitrates in our areas. So to give you a little brief status of nitrates in St. Croix County groundwater, I thought it would be good to first give some basics. We're going back to school here. I'll talk about the water cycle. So what is groundwater? Groundwater exists in the underground saturated areas. We actually have an extensive amount of groundwater. We have about 30% of the world's fresh water is located in these underground spaces. And it's our most recycled resource. So if you think about the water cycle that you learned about in school, it's the cycle of water. The water may change in its location and distribution on the planet, but really the quantity, the amount of it stays the same. So if you took a shower this morning, the water that you showered with, it's possible that that same water is the water that the dinosaurs took a drink from also. So it's kind of cool that it's such a recycled resource. And it's really important in our drinking water as well as irrigation and food production, as well as supporting the ecosystems that we care about and enjoy. One thing about water, though, is it's considered a universal solvent. It's really good for mixing things, which is great when you're cooking. It's not so great when you're thinking about the water cycle. So what that means is that what happens on the soil surface is easily transported into our groundwater because water must infiltrate through the soils to get down into our groundwater reserves. So what happens on the soil can make its way into our groundwater if it's soluble. Our number one contaminant in Wisconsin is nitrate. This is a map from the USGS showing the highest risk for contamination of nitrates across the United States. You can see where we're located. Let's see if I can turn on a pointer real quick. We're located right over here in Wisconsin where this red and orange are mixing, indicating that our area is at high risk for nitrate contamination. Now, this is mostly due to high nitrogen inputs. We have a lot of agriculture in our area. It's also due to well-drained soils, and we also have low inputs of wooded areas. So the ratio of woodland areas to cropland is low. So what is nitrogen and why does it matter if it makes its way into groundwater? So nitrogen is actually one of our basic elements. It makes up about 78% of the air we breathe. Nitrogen is really essential for living things as it's a key component of proteins, nucleic acids, the DNA that make us up. It even is responsible for the aurora borealis. So if you're familiar with the auroras in the sky, the colorful colors that dance, that's from nitrogen and oxygen colliding in space and creating these beautiful colors. However, as important as nitrogen is to plants, plants can't uptake nitrogen in the form of just N. It needs to be in nitrate, which is NO3. So this is when nitrate is combined with 3 oxygen atoms. And nitrates are naturally occur in soil and water. We've also learned to make them in certain instances for fertilizers. And that's because nitrate is vital for plants. It's a component of chlorophyll and thus allows photosynthesis and plants to grow. So the development of nitrogen fertilizers has actually helped farmers extensively in providing higher yields more consistently, which is very important in supporting food security worldwide. So it is a good thing. However, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. It comes down to timing and quantity. So you want to make sure that nitrates are being applied the right amounts at the right time to really improve our nitrate production or crop production. So why can it be a bad thing? So nitrates are very soluble in water, meaning that it can travel very easily through the ground and accumulate in our aquifers. Going over this schematic, I'll talk a little bit about the sources of nitrates that are out there. There are natural atmospheric sources of nitrates, as well as fertilized lawns, septic systems, animal waste, agricultural fertilizers, and decomposing matter can all be sources of nitrates. Now, in a normal setting, you have some type of vegetation on the ground, and whatever plant matter is down there will utilize nitrate. However, they can't use everything. So if nitrate is applied in excess, and a rain comes, that nitrate will end up trickling down and leaching into the ground and then down into the water table, where it can then be taken in by private wells. So in this schematic, and keep in mind, I just made it because I couldn't find a diagram that I liked, so it's not perfect. I have different pictures of plants with different root matters. The root masses are not drawn to scale or anything, but I do want to emphasize that the plants that are on the landscape utilize nitrates differently. So prairie plants have a very extensive root network that will uptake a lot more nitrogen. Crops have a little less of a root network, and then same with lawn. So depending on what the plant is, they're able to utilize more or less of the nitrates that are applied. And then here we have two homes with the gray bars represent our private wells. And so depending on maybe how deep the well is or what it's tapping into, you might have nitrates that are different levels depending on the different homes. So in this example, I just have one that's at 10 milligrams per liter, which is the EPA drinking water standard, and it's next door to one that's 5. So this is very common. A lot of people will frequently say, my neighbor's water is safe. Why is mine high? And it depends on a variety of things. It depends on the depth of the well, the quality of the well. There's a number of different things that can affect that, which is why the EPA does recommend that private well owners test their wells annually for nitrates. One of the programs that St. Croix County offers is to help residents be able to do that. So we provide these free nitrate screening water clinics like we're doing today, where we have a nitrate probe and we can give you an estimate of what the nitrates are in your water. Now, our probe is a YSI probe with a nitrate probe. It's not a standardized test, which is why we call it a screening tool. It gives you an idea of where you fall. If we screen you as being high, we do recommend it gets followed up with a standardized test that might go to UW-Stevens Point. But overall, we had 8 different clinics in 2025. It was our 5th year doing free nitrate clinics. We've been doing them since about 2020, and we've screened about 2,000 samples doing this over the 5 years that we've had them. In 2025, we had 469 total water samples that were screened from 448 different addresses. A couple people came to a couple different ones throughout the year, and you can kind of see the different ones that we had. Baldwin and New Richmond were our largest clinics where we brought in more people, but we did try to kind of have it spread out. We had a clinic in Forest and Wilson to kind of cover the more rural areas so that we can be accessible to homeowners depending on where they are in St. Croix County. Now we can use that data to understand what nitrates look like in our county a little bit. Keep in mind, these are from 8 different clinics that vary seasonally. So we have them throughout the summer. In 2025, it was April through December that we had nitrate clinics. So when you look at the data, it is variable. But what you do see is that the average nitrates were 7.77, and the majority of people fell into this 5 to 9.9 category, indicating that land use is making its way into the water. So if land use were not affecting your water quality, you'd expect your nitrates to be about 0 to 2 milligrams per liter. Anything above 2 indicates that there's some source of nitrate that's man-made and making its way into your well. We did have about 27% of people that screened higher than that EPA drinking water standard of 10. So that's pretty significant because if you think about all the wells that we have, and then if you think there might be about 27% that might be above this drinking water standard. It's really important, and hopefully people are aware enough that they want to get it tested. We can also use this data to start to look at which townships in St. Croix County are most affected by nitrates. So here we use this nitrate tier status that was developed by the Wisconsin DNR in 2020. They used the Minnesota Department of Agriculture's tier status to kind of develop this nitrate sensitive tier status. Tier 1 are going to be red, and this is where greater than 10% of the wells exceed the 10 milligram per liter drinking water standard, and the average nitrates are greater than 5.4 milligrams per liter. So these are the areas that already have a nitrate contamination problem. We're already seeing elevated levels of nitrates in these red townships. The little numbers underneath them are how many samples we have from those townships. And we do require 25 samples to be able to do a tier status on them. So Forest is the only township that we don't have enough samples to do tier status for. The yellow tier is going to be tier 2. That's where greater than 5% of the wells exceed the drinking water standard, or nitrates are greater than 5.4 milligrams per liter. We have a few of those kind of speckled around the perimeter of our county, indicating that they do have high nitrates, but it's not quite as big of a problem yet as those tier 1 locations. Tier 3 is the best tier we have, so that's where less than 5% of the wells exceed the drinking water standard, and their average nitrates are less than 5.4. So we have 3 townships in the county where the nitrates fall into that tier 3 category, which is really great, and that's where in a perfect world you'd want all the townships to fall. Yeah.
The little kind of squiggly gray areas, those are municipal areas, is that right?
Yes.
So those people would be on municipal wells.
Correct.
From a population density standpoint, is there an estimate of how many residents are on private wells?
Yes, we do have an estimate. Yeah, Tim has that number and he can get that for you. So in 2026, we do plan to continue our free drinking water screening clinics. Today is the first one of the year that we're offering, but we have 5 more throughout the year that are already scheduled. So those are listed on the side if you didn't bring a water sample to be screened today, or if you want to spread the word and tell other people about what we're offering here. In addition, I do want to plug that we have this Know Your Water survey going on in the county right now. If you haven't taken it yet, I highly recommend that you do it. It's a great way to get your input in on how you feel about the safety of your water, if you have any treatments, and what you think are concerning contaminants that matter to you that can really help direct our focus and what we end up doing for research or providing to you as services. So if you haven't done this already, please do take the time to take that survey. Another program that St. Croix County has been doing is the Citizen Groundwater Monitoring Program, the CGMP. This is a really phenomenal project that's been going on since 2019, meaning that 2025 is the 7th year that it's been completed. It's a long-term study focused on nitrate, where 160 wells are sampled annually at the same time every fall. And these samples do get sent to UW Stevens Point. So it's not our probe that's getting it, it's a standardized test from the university. So the results from this study, I feel very confident reflect the nitrates in our county. Yes.
Sign up for that, or do they pick you, or you pick them?
The question is if they sign up for this or if we pick them. We had people sign up for it. So we aren't accepting new people because we're sampling the exact same wells every year. So the 160 wells were determined back in 2019. And how they picked them was a very scientifically defensive way where it's a very uniform distribution. This is the map that they created when they were looking for people. So based on where you were located, only one person could sign up for a certain radius. So it's a very evenly distributed sample size here that's getting tested every year. The results of the 2025 sampling effort were that the average nitrates averaged 5.48 milligrams per liter. So this is lower than the average nitrates that we observed at our nitrate clinics. But as I said, it's a standardized test. I feel very confident that that is reflective of our county. Looking here, we have nitrate on the x-axis and then count on the y-axis, so you can see the distribution of samples. We had 15% of people that were greater than the drinking water standard this year. That is one of the values that changed from the past since 2019. It's the highest we've seen. So we had normally seen between 12 to 14%. This year we bumped it up a little with 15% of these people who've been testing annually were above that drinking water standard. However, our range did decrease. So in the past, our range was about 0 to 37 milligrams per liter or 47 milligrams per liter. This year, there's one person who was kind of the outlier, and their well did drop to about 25. So that's a pretty big drop for them. However, it didn't seem to skew the nitrate averages. The nitrate averages were still very similar to what we've seen in the past. We can also map these points to find out where we might have hotspots or what areas are experiencing the highest nitrates in the county. The spatial distribution has remained relatively constant over the 7 years that we've done this study. This map shows that distribution of samples based on their nitrate levels. So the white dots represent nitrate less than 1 milligram per liter, and those are typically found kind of on the perimeter of our county border. The green dots represent samples that were 1.1 to 5 milligrams per liter. Those are also kind of located around the perimeter, maybe going inward a little bit, but mostly on the perimeter. The yellow dots or orange dots are 5.1 to 9.9 milligrams per liter. Those are speckled throughout the county. And then the red dots are the samples that were greater than the drinking water standard of 10. Those are much more central. So if you were to kind of draw a diagonal oblong circle around the county, you'd kind of capture that hotspot area of where we have high nitrates in the county. These geological patterns, or this nitrate pattern really aligns with the geological patterns we see as well. It's where we have a lot of high agriculture, so it aligns with our land use, our shallow well depths, and then tapping into the Prairie du Chien aquifer for our water source. So something that's really exciting is that with long-term data, you can start to do trend testing and see what types of trends you can observe in this data. So I used a Mann-Kendall test for trend to look at if these wells are experiencing increases in nitrates or decreases. It does require about 6 years of data. However, the more data that you have, the better your trend testing will be. And it generates this tau value, which is used to determine the trend strength. The tau can range from -1 to 1. -1 are going to be our blues. That indicates a negative trend, which is a good thing. That means the nitrates are decreasing. However, a positive value indicates a positive trend. That's where nitrates would be increasing. That's what you don't necessarily want to see. And then that tau value you can use to determine if the trend is strong, moderate, weak, or if there's no trend. When there's no trend, there's two patterns that we either see. Either there's no change. This is a well that has the exact same value year after year. This is very common in wells that have low levels of nitrate or no nitrate. So if it's 0.1 in 2019, it's probably still 0.1 now. That will be the no change category. Versus the no trend is a well that's very variable. There's no trend that you can observe because one year it's 5, the next year it's 3, the next year it's 6. It kind of bounces around. That's going to be the no trend category. But the most emerging trend that we do see is the increasing trend in nitrates. Yep. The question is, what would make it go down? That's a great question, but I think some of what Tim's going to talk about will answer that. So conservation practices, making sure wells are clean and there isn't anything directly above your wellhead. There's a couple different things that could lead to those decreases. And I think Tim's presentation is tackling nitrates, and I think that should answer it pretty well. So overall, we see this increasing trend. However, this isn't statistically significant yet. So I did apply a p-value of 0.05, which is a very common p-value to identify statistically significant changes. And we found that there were 34 wells that did have a statistically significant increase. The majority of these wells were increasing. So about 26 of the wells were found to be increasing, and 8 wells were found to have a decreasing pattern. The rate of increase is slightly more in the increasing wells compared to the decreasing. So overall, the prominent trend that we are seeing are that nitrates are increasing from these past 7 years. So in summary, the CGMP really provides a very valuable data set to better understand our groundwater. It's geographically diverse, spatially inclusive, and statistically defensible. However, the more data we have, the better our trend analysis will be. So this graph here is the municipal well in Roberts, and the 24-year trend shows a very clear increase. So if you look back at some of the increases we have, they're pretty minor increases. And if you were to look at this 24-year trend, and let's say you just look at these few years here, you might think that the nitrates are decreasing. So depending on what time chunk you look at, you might see a different pattern. But once you put it together and you have that long data set, you can see a clear pattern in the way things are trending. So overall, this trend is revealing kind of that ongoing need for targeted action to address nitrate contamination in our county. So just to kind of summarize everything, the status of nitrates in St. Croix County, it is the most widespread contaminant in Wisconsin as well as St. Croix County. However, nitrates do tend to be higher in concentration and high prevalence of above the drinking water standard than the state. So St. Croix County does have these higher levels of nitrates compared to the full state average, and they tend to be increasing, which is why we highly encourage residents to screen or test their water annually. And then this year we're working on improving our knowledge to know about more treatment options out there and how treatments are performing. Because I feel like a lot of people say, okay, I have high nitrates, what's next? So I do want to say that the county is very interested in looking into solutions or treatment options and having more information on that front. So that's part of why that survey is so important. It can help us get a better idea of what kind of treatments are out there and what are working. So with that, I'll take any questions. Yes?
You mentioned nitrates as the key contaminant. Are there other ones similar to this or close to this one that we also should be concerned about?
Yeah, so the question is that we've talked mostly about nitrates, but are there other contaminants that we should be aware of? And yes, I think there's always other things. If you have nitrates in your well, you probably have other things in your well too. It kind of is an indication that land use is making its way down. Nitrates is the one that has the most prominent health concerns. I know a lot of people have concerns over PFAS. However, we have done some preliminary testing in the county, and although we do find it ubiquitously throughout the county, they're generally in low levels. We don't have high hotspots of PFAS as there is in like Minnesota. But nitrates are really the one to be more concerned with, and there's going to be a number of health reasons for why it's important, and that's where Genevieve will talk next and talk about those health implications. All right. Yes?
The citizens groundwater monitoring, how long is that indefinite as of now, or is it?
There is a cutoff time, so I think the plan was 10 years. I think we're willing to keep continuing doing nitrate as long as we're able to. But I think what's been agreed on by the county is a 10-year study. So this will be the 8th year. So we should have 2 more years after this, for sure.
My name is Genevieve Palazzolo. I am the public health strategist here in St. Croix County, and I'm going to talk about some of the health implications of nitrates. So as Patty just highlighted, quite a few private wells in our county, as well as Wisconsin as a whole, have high nitrates in their water. But what does that really mean for your health? So the first thing we're going to talk about is how this works. How do nitrates go from water to into your body and kind of the mechanism of action? So nitrates and nitrites, they kind of convert back and forth into each other. As we heard, nitrate is NO3, nitrite is NO2. So just a binding or loss of oxygen. And when that happens, they enter into the red blood cells through your bloodstream. So nitrates absorb about 25% in saliva, and then 75% is absorbed in your small intestine. So when you intake water high in nitrates, those nitrates kind of flow throughout the body and enter the bloodstream. And when they enter the bloodstream, it can make it difficult for the cells to bind to oxygen effectively. And as we know, oxygen's super important. You need that to live. So it kind of causes a problem in delivery of that oxygen to the rest of the body. And the other big concern is that nitrates and nitrites combine with other things when they enter the stomach. So as they kind of flow through that GI system, that digestive tract, they can form N-nitrous compounds or NOCs. And these are the things that we know cause cancer. So the big one that's a main concern is, and bear with me here, this is a tricky word, is methemoglobinemia. And this is what we call blue baby syndrome. It's most common in infants and small children. Also, pregnant women are at an increased risk. And infants who are consuming formula, because that's being mixed with the water, are at a very significant risk. And this can occur with a very small amount because babies have smaller systems. It enters their blood system a lot faster, causing them to lose their ability to get all the oxygen that they need. And that's why we call it blue baby. They tend to get blue in the fingernails, and that's due to a loss of oxygen in the airways and extremities. And that can occur within a very short time frame. So that could occur within hours or days, depending on the nitrate concentration. So that's why it's really important. And it's relatively rare, but can be fatal. So that's why we really highlight this as a main top concern. And just because we're highly concerned in small children doesn't mean that it's not bad for adults as well. But this is kind of where the standard comes from, which I'll talk about in a second here. And it is also important to note, just so you guys are fully understanding of where this information comes from, it's based on the EPA regulations. The nitrates and nitrites are not a carcinogen, but when they enter the body and start mixing with everything else that you have, those NOCs are carcinogens, so they do cause cancer. But the nitrates and nitrites are things that, contribute to that. And then looking at our drinking water standard. So why is it that 10 milligrams per liter? This is based on a really large scale study that was done and found that, for that blue baby syndrome, the number of cases was associated as nitrates increased. So the more nitrates they found in the water, the more cases they saw. So as you can see on the chart on the left side there, when you have less than 10, they didn't see any cases. When you're in that 11 to 20 range, they started to see a few. When you're over that 100, they're seeing almost 100 cases. They found in more recent studies that there could be potential that we maybe want to lower that limit, but EPA still considers that less than 10 to be the standard. So other health effects, more concerning to you all as adults in the room, we're looking at things like colorectal cancer, thyroid cancer, ovarian cancer, and then pregnancy outcomes for women. So colorectal cancer, high nitrates levels were associated with about a 16% increase in the likelihood of developing colorectal cancer. That's because it's going through your GI system. We just learned that, most of the uptake is in that small intestine, so that's how those kind of relate together. Thyroid, high nitrate can cause about a 3 times increase in thyroid cancer. The mechanism, nitrates are easily absorbed and within that kind of hormone pathway where the thyroid is involved as well. Ovarian cancer is a 2 times increase, and then pregnancy outcomes, high nitrates in water have been associated with fetal deaths due to loss of oxygen, low birth weight, prematurity, neural tube defects, and congenital malformities. So significant things that we really want to look out for, and that's why nitrates are something that we really want to highlight as important to look out for in the water. And then other related symptoms that you might be feeling that could be a cause attributed to nitrates. So things like low blood pressure, high heart rate, increased headaches, stomach cramping or vomiting. These are all related symptoms that could be due to high nitrate in the water. And then we did want to highlight it's important that we look at nitrates in water, but outside of water, they're also used in lunch meats, things like hot dogs, as a preservative factor. And they're used to prevent bacteria growth, but the impact on human health is very closely related to the concentration in food as well as water. So that's why you might hear, that's one of the things you should limit is deli meats and things like that. Nitrates is one of the reasons that it's recommended to limit that intake. And then I have some room for questions. Yeah. Yes.
The health risk, is that just from drinking or is that like showering or anything? Will that do it?
Okay, so the question was health risk is just from drinking or from showering, interacting with the water. It's due to the ingestion of the water. So you can wash your hands in that water, you can shower, but ingesting the water is the main source of where you would get nitrate impact. You had one over here?
No, sorry, I was just.
Okay. Anyone else? Great. And then I do have some sources at the end here just as a reference in case anyone is looking for more information. These are some helpful resources as well as some studies done that support the data as far as health concerns.
Hello, everyone. As Patty said, I am Cayla, and I am with the Center for Watershed Science Education in Stevens Point. So, as Patty was describing the results from the 7-year, hopefully 10-year study of nitrate in the county, the lab in Stevens Point is actually located within the center that I am with. So, I am with the water testing lab in Stevens Point that has tested the nitrate samples over the years for the county. So today I'm going to go over testing and treatment, but I will start with a little bit of review based on the things that we're already spoken about just to get everyone up to speed since we're learning a lot today. So some of this will be things you have heard before, but again, just reinforcing those concepts before we get into more of the nitty gritty. So as Patty already described, groundwater is water that exists underground and fills the spaces like pores and fractures of geologic materials. So those geologic materials vary like gravel, sand, silt, clay, and then different types of bedrock. And that all plays into how susceptible a well is to be contaminated by nitrates, as Patty also described. And some of that susceptibility comes down to aquifers. So aquifers are essentially geologic formations that store and hold groundwater. I like to think of them as like a rigid sponge that is saturated with water. So water can move within that sponge vertically and horizontally. It doesn't flow quite like a river or a lake, as many of us probably imagine when you think about groundwater. That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind, but it's more so saturated, rigid materials filled with water. The properties of an aquifer, though, determine how likely and how quickly water is to be contaminated, either by human or natural sources. So some aquifers contain materials that are naturally detrimental to health, which we're not talking about today, but things like arsenic and other metals are some examples of that. And some aquifers are more prone to contamination from activities at the land surface. So we'll talk about that more today. So just before we talk about like aquifer properties and how they affect how likely it is to be contaminated, it's important to consider groundwater movement and what affects that movement. Because as Patty mentioned with the water cycle, everything that happens above the land surface does make its way into the groundwater. And the rate and volume of how much water moves through groundwater is really important to consider when we're thinking about nitrate contamination. So through materials that have larger spaces in them, like cracks and fractures, which there is some geology in this area where materials are more prone to cracks and fractures to transmit water. Water will move very quickly through those spaces. And the more quickly water moves through geologic material, the less time there is for filtering out of contaminants. On the flip side, there are other materials like certain types of sandstone that have very, very small pore sizes that water move more slowly through. Those pores are very interconnected though, so water still moves at a pretty rapid rate compared to other materials like say a clay where water is going to move very, very slowly through and not be easy to transmit into other areas. So in Wisconsin, we've got 4 major aquifers that I'll just breeze through. At the very, very bottom of our state, there's a crystalline bedrock aquifer that is essentially formed billions of years ago when the continent was being formed. So that's like our oldest aquifer, not used very often, especially in this area, but it is one that wells occasionally pull from in other areas of the state. On top of that aquifer, though, is what we call our sandstone and dolomite aquifer. This is present in St. Croix County and it has typically pretty good well yields. It is composed of sandstone and dolomite, which is another type of rock that has a lot of calcium and magnesium in it. So if you have hard water, odds are there's a lot of calcium and magnesium in it. Often those wells are in dolomite. Both are pretty good aquifers. Over to our friends at the east, we do have another aquifer there. It's not relevant for St. Croix County, but it is a fun fact if you've ever been to Door County and noticed some of the characteristic like sea caves and like geology of Door County. That's because of an aquifer over there, but I'll just breeze over that because we're not talking about that today. And then on top of everything, kind of like frosting on a cake, is the surficial or glacial aquifers. So Wisconsin has a rich glacial history, why we have so many Great Lakes. But this material was deposited by glaciers over hundreds, tens of thousands of years. And this material varies in thickness throughout the state. The driftless area or the very southwest of Wisconsin does not have this material, but this aquifer and the sandstone and dolomite in blue are the two that wells in this area are most likely to be coming from. And that sandstone and gravel aquifer varies, like I said, in thickness and composition. So in areas where that material is thinner, there's going to be less time to filter out groundwater as it moves down. In areas where that material is, say, made of something like sand or gravel, again, water is going to move more quickly through that material into the bedrock below. So if we were to look at St. Croix County, the aquifers that are present are a few that Patty mentioned as well, like the Prairie du Chien dolomite. So primarily the geologic materials here at the bedrock are going to be either the sandstone or dolomite. So sandstone's a great aquifer. It holds water very well. It holds a lot of it and it transmits water well, but it is also something that if it becomes contaminated, it's easy for water to move through, right? So good to keep in mind. Dolomite, another good aquifer. In some cases, dolomite is more prone to erosion by water, so it can have those cracks and fractures a little bit that I talked about earlier, that water moves more quickly through. So that's the geologic material underneath the surficial aquifer, which I have kind of out of order here. So that surficial or top layer of material in St. Croix County is primarily sand and gravel. And this is really close to home, at least for me, coming from Stevens Point. We're in the central sands of Wisconsin, and we have a lot of agriculture over there, lots of nitrate contamination. Big part of that is sand and gravel. Water moves very quickly through sand. Sand grains are large, right? When you feel sand in your hand, water is going to move quickly through those materials and bringing with it anything from the land use. And then if we look at the thickness of those surficial deposits or geologic materials on top of the bedrock, that thickness also plays into the time it takes for a contaminant to filter out. So in areas on this map where we have like the green, which doesn't show up really well here, there's like a lighter green, that's going to be thicker, so like 50 to 100 feet deep or even thicker than 100 feet. So there might even be enough water in those areas for a well to be drilled into that material and not even have to go to the bedrock. But in areas where that material is thinner, so like the red, yellow, and orange, it's going to be a little bit thinner, so might not be deep enough for a well to be drilled there, and it may be more prone to contamination as well, because again, less material, less time for things to filter out. Okay, and this is just another snippet of the results from this year of the study that Patty showed. So just to summarize what all that was, is that there are many factors that affect the susceptibility of a well and groundwater to contamination from something like nitrate. So we have the depth to the water table. So the water table is like the top of that saturated zone that Patty was describing where groundwater is. And that plays into the distance and time it takes for things to be filtered, like contaminants like nitrate. There's the surficial sediment type. So those are the things like sand and gravel and that composition on top of bedrock. There's groundwater recharge, which is how much water is actually going into the ground, and that depends on, precipitation, again, the material composition and how much groundwater is moving down and how much that's bringing with it. And then we have the depth to bedrock, which is that map I showed a few slides back where we have this depth of surficial deposits. So it's a lot of information, but the key point I want you to take away here is that there are a lot of natural factors that play into groundwater contamination susceptibility, but there are also factors that we influence that impact groundwater susceptibility. So one of those is the contaminant source and land use. So as Patty described, different cropping systems may be more or less susceptible to contribute to nitrate contamination based on how well they uptake nitrate and use it for growth, and how much is applied as well varies between different cropping types. And then well construction is another really, really big thing that plays into how likely your well is to be impacted by something like nitrate, which often brings up the question of, okay, well, I know I have a really deep well, so I should be fine, right? It does come in a lot, and it's a good thing to have a deep well, definitely, but it's not the only thing that matters. And I want to show that through this little high-tech graphic here. We've got a well. The black is like what we would call the well casing. And well casing is like usually metal, sometimes it's PVC, but when a well is drilled or bored into the ground, the structure of that opening must be maintained. Casing does that so that the earth doesn't cave in and then you don't have a well, you just have a hole you tried to drill. But casing also prevents water from flowing into a well at a given depth. So in areas like in this example, we have a really deep well, right? But the casing just goes to just underneath the water table. These yellow arrows indicate that that well is pulling water from all of those depths. And think about like the path of least resistance, right? That water at the top, depending also on where the pump is located, is more likely to be pulled in by that well. Even though it's a deep well, it's still getting water from pretty close to the surface. If that casing is extended though, that well is now pulling water from much deeper. That water is going to be a little bit older. It's going to have had more time to filter out any contaminants, things like that. So just want to reinforce that it's not just well depth, it's well construction. And at the end of my slides, I'll have a resource that will hopefully help you find your well construction report. If you don't know that, it's helpful to know well construction details. Even if it's the age of a well as like a well owner and user, it's good information to have. Okay, more review before we get into the new stuff. This is just some of the sources that we see for nitrate. By far, agricultural activity is the largest, but things like septic systems, lawn fertilizer, animal waste, and other biosolids are also large contributors.
So if we test it today,
Mhm.
could that test be different in 2 months, 2 months later? Could we expect what we got today is a pretty solid number, or would that be fluctuating based on?
We'd still recommend just retesting since today's a screen, but in terms of like annual or intra-annual fluctuations, it's not huge. Like you'd think like logically, right? It's like, oh, in summertime, there's more rain, there's more fertilizer being applied, we should have higher nitrate then, right? And it actually is a lot slower than that. Like everything with geology and groundwater happens on such slow timescales, more in the order of years. So there are some like little waves, maybe throughout a year, but things often kind of even out over time. So it takes longer for that to show. So the main thing really is to just test annually if you can, because that would be something like Patty and the study that they're doing in the county is that it takes a long time for things to show. So
Certain time of year it's best to do that?
it honestly, I'd say it depends on what you want to look for. Just generally, if we're talking about like water testing, there's nothing wrong with testing in the winter. In a lot of cases, it's actually good because it's more of like a static picture of groundwater because there is less recharge. So for nitrate specifically, I wouldn't expect it to be a huge difference. We do see some differences year to year, but again, as far as like the general overall like status of where your well is at for nitrate, I wouldn't expect to see like a big difference if you were taking it like say now or in a few months. It's definitely a much slower shift. It's a great question. Yeah.
We tested tested wells for 2 years every month. And we found that the wells that were higher, say you had 8 part per million or 10 or 12, we had a whole bunch of wells. The wells that were low in nitrates didn't fluctuate hardly at all. Whereas the variation in the well, if you have an 8.5 part per million sample result, chances are you're gonna go over 10 during that, sometime during that year. And, we also found that the wells in our area, tended to respond quite quickly.
And I
There is periodic times that,
Yeah.
where they tend to be high, but since I can't predict the weather, I can't really say, well, this is the best time, because I don't know what the weather's gonna be.
A lot of it does depend on the aquifer too, so like some of the geology. It's more like a general statement that it doesn't vary a ton, but in isolated or like, more regional scales, it
Yeah,
could be
but
more
we looked at
likely.
The charts from the previous
Yeah.
that kind of correlates to what you said there, that when they're in that range of sort of risky,
Yeah.
they'll change a lot more.
Which makes sense, right? Because those wells, like if it is already high, they're clearly being impacted by the land use, so they would be more likely to change than one that was much lower. Yeah. So these are just a review of the health effects. So again, there's that federal and state health standard of 10 milligrams per liter. Infants are the most vulnerable, as are expecting women. So methemoglobinemia, or that blue baby disease, is the biggest risk and is a more immediate health concern. And then some of those other concerns, like the increased risk of cancer, are more gradual and chronic from long-term exposure to nitrate. Okay, so let's get into interpreting results. Ideally, you'll get your water tested. I see a lot of jars brought today for this screen. So hopefully this will help you get an initial idea of where your water's at. If today is your first time doing a screen, or if you've tested in the past and have results to refer to, this should help you with that. So typically anything like 0.2 milligrams per liter or less, there's, some variation in that. But generally speaking, nitrate in Wisconsin groundwater is quite low. So we would consider something that low to be natural concentrations. Above that, when we have like kind of that 0.2 to 2 milligrams per liter, that's kind of transitional. It's very likely the well is having some influence from external activity, but it's quite slow. It's very minimal, so that's why we would say transitional. When we get above 2 and between 10, there's definitely some evidence of human impact from things like land use activity, whether it be septic system, agriculture, animal waste, things like that. When we reach 10 or above, we've exceeded that standard. There are certain steps you'd want to take that I'll go over. So 10 is going to be like that cutoff point. Honestly, as Tim mentioned, once you get up around like 7, 8, 9, that's when you really want to keep an eye on it, because odds are if your well has reached 7, 8, or 9, it's probably going to peak over 10 at some point. So if we were to break that down a little bit more and like next steps, so if you had let's say a low nitrate result, so less than 2 or less than 0.2, little to no human influence. It's beneficial to retest in the future, but the likelihood of that changing, certainly substantially, is quite low. So you wouldn't necessarily have to test every year. The blanket recommendation is to test every year, but when you're that low, you could probably get away stretching it out a little bit, but still retest, because groundwater quality does change over time. It's just a little bit slower depending on where you're starting at. So in this case, retesting is good, but you don't have to test like immediately every year on the clock, because if it goes up, it's going to be a little bit of a slower increase when you're this low. And your well just may be, depending on construction, less likely to be susceptible to groundwater contamination. So overall, if it's low, less than 2, low concern, right? When we get in between 2 and 10, there's some additional ways we can kind of break that range down. So when we have, say you're between like 2 and 5, retest annually. Your well, does definitely having some human impact. It's good to keep an eye on. Just doing an annual retest would, even if it's a screen to just get an idea of where things are at, would be good. If you're at 5 or above, definitely continuing to retest annually. And consider testing for pesticides as well. I'd say when you get to this point, and generally always you want to retest after a screen, because it's like a screen is like a wonderful tool. Like when you go to the doctor, right? You have a health screen. If it indicates that there's maybe a little flag, you go in for additional testing to make sure everything is shipshape and get more details. So definitely doing a retest annually, 5 or above, and then again, consider testing for pesticides. There are some screens actually for pesticides that you can do. because if the evidence is there that your well is being impacted so much by nitrate, there is also some higher likelihood then that your well would have pesticide influence as well. Once we get above 5 into like at 10 milligrams per liter, that's when those health considerations really apply. And we recommend using an alternative water source for drinking and cooking, and then considering treatment, which I'll get into more in the next few slides. Kind of repeating what I said about 10 on the other slide, but when we're reaching 10 milligrams per liter or higher, definitely is exceeding those drinking water health standards. And we do recommend it, as I mentioned, using an alternative source of water for drinking and cooking. As it came up, laundry, like bathing, things like that are fine. It's the consumption of the water that's the concern. And then again, considering water treatment. Which brings me to water treatment and a little primer on that. There are two primary types of water treatment devices. The first one is what we would call a point of entry. And that's where the water source for your home essentially enters your home. So if you're on a private well, that's going to be where your pressure tank is located, right? Where it's coming out from the well pump, pressure tank's probably in the basement or utility room, something like that. That's where those point of entry filters go. So when you think of like a water softener, if you have one of those, it's located at the start, essentially, of all of the downstream plumbing in your home. These treat larger volumes because they're treating water for the whole home. So because of that, they tend to be a little bit more involved to install and a little bit more expensive. On the flip side, we have what we call point of use water treatment systems. And this is especially relevant for something like nitrate, where the health concern is from consuming the water. So when it comes to drinking and cooking, that's the water you really want to treat, right? You don't need to treat all of the water in your home if you have high nitrate, unless you want to drink from every single sink and have like little kiddos who maybe like going into the bathroom at night to drink from the bathroom sink, then maybe you want to, reevaluate things a little bit. But these, they treat smaller volumes because they're not treating the whole home, which is one of the downsides of them, but usually doesn't pose an issue for people. And an example of this that we'll talk about in more detail today is a reverse osmosis system. So I just want to point out as well that there is not a catch-all water treatment solution for all contaminants. They are designed to treat specific things. So if you're like, well, I have a water filter at home, why isn't that working? It's because there's too many variations in like the chemistry and technologies for there to be one perfect catch-all. At least, yeah, maybe one day. And then the cost does vary within both types. So cost varies for point of entry systems and cost varies for point of use systems as well. And both systems do come with maintenance considerations as well. So there's not really a way where you can get out of having to maintain a system. It's just going to vary depending on the system that you go with. Oh, all right. Okay, so before we get into a little bit more details, I want to pause and go over some questions that you may be thinking and questions we frequently get when it comes to nitrate health and treatment and testing. So should you still drink your water if it's above the 10 milligram health advisory? It's really up to you. It's free world, right? But it's recommended not to due to those health considerations. So even if it's again like close to 10, I would consider finding those alternative drinking water sources for cooking as well and considering treatment. So it's really recommended not to consume the water if it's 10 or above. This question I've kind of already answered myself, but should I still use my water for cooking? And the answer of that is no. A lot of the times when, you hear about like a boil water advisory or water contamination, you think bacteria, and I can boil my water and kill that, and that removes it from the water, right? When we are considering dissolved substances like nitrate, boiling can actually increase concentrations. As you boil water and it evaporates off, nitrate's left behind. So we don't want to use that water for cooking or things like preparing like formula, jello, water-intensive foods, oatmeal, stuff like that. Can you use your water for bathing and laundry? We've chatted about this already. Yes, totally fine. And then how can you reduce your concentrations? So water treatment devices, reverse osmosis, distillation, and ion exchange are the three types I'll be discussing today that are kind of like the options for nitrate water treatment. In some cases, changing well depth or relocating a well will do it, but I just want to say that's a pretty expensive gamble. It does not guarantee that you would have lower nitrate from increasing your well depth or relocating a well. In some extreme cases, that might be the only choice someone has if their nitrate's incredibly high and treatment's not going to be as effective, but these are rare cases. And there usually should be another reason you need a new well if it's old or has other issues, because drilling a well is expensive. And if you're banking on that to reduce your nitrate and it doesn't, you're probably going to be pretty disappointed and you'll have spent a lot of money. And then just lastly, you could just continue to use an alternative source of water for drinking and cooking, but over time that gets pretty costly when you consider buying bottled water or treated water from the store.
Question, is bottled water tested also for nitrates?
I believe it is just due to the health standard, but I'm not as familiar with the process and regulations when it comes to bottled water facilities. I know our lab has, I think a student did like a research project once because we have college students working in the lab, and they did test bottled water, and I think it had nitrate, and it was like 6, maybe 7, because it's got to be under 10, right? So if they're testing it and it's 2 or 8, it doesn't matter because it's under the health standard. Not to make anyone afraid of anything, but that's the standard, right? So there's not a guarantee, I guess.
Do water filters like, Bria or Zero Water, do they help take out the nitrates?
Unfortunately not. And I'll get into some of like the reasons why that is when I talk about the ones that do, but unfortunately they do not. They're still good to have for sure because they do filter out other substances and help the water taste better, but when it comes to nitrate specifically, they do not. Yeah. Okay, so when you're considering treatment or if you're considering treatment, there's something to look out for because it's a daunting process. I talk to people every day who are like, oh my gosh, there's so many systems. How do I know which one, should I spend my money on? Because even the low cost ones, it's still, there are some that are 60, some that are $100. That's not nothing. And then there are some that are $500, $600, $1,000. So it's a big purchase. It's a big deal, right? To make this commitment to treat your water. So there are 2 entities that are independent, like third party certifying and testing bodies. And those are the National Sanitation Foundation, or NSF, and ANSI, or the American National Standards Institute. So these 2 work together and have certifications actually for water treatment systems, both municipal and for private water, actually. But what we're talking about today is for private wells. So these certifications essentially indicate that the claims a manufacturer is making for, say, contaminant reduction are verifiable. They will test those products from a company, and if it meets their stamp of approval, they get a little certification. That product has been certified, and you know that their claims are reliable because they were vetted by a third party. And it also often tests for the safety of the materials that things are made with. So they will actually look at more of like the components of a system to make sure that they themselves are not leaching anything harmful into the water. So there's a few different certification types I'm going to mention, but really the best thing to do if you're looking at a system is to go to their search page. So you can search by manufacturer and it'll bring up all of that manufacturer's products that are certified, and it'll list which certifications that product has. And this QR code takes you directly to their site. I have the link here as well. So if there's any like slide sharing or information sharing after the fact, you should have this. Otherwise, you can email me directly and I'm happy to send you the link. It's also very searchable. If you search like the NSF ANSI like search, it should come up. Okay, so the first treatment type to remove nitrate from water is a reverse osmosis system. So this is primarily considered a point of use system. So this is going to be treating that water that's for a specific use, like drinking and cooking, right? These typically go in the kitchen. They can fit under sinks. They can also go on the countertop next to a sink. They're pretty small in most cases. The price range for these does vary quite a bit, which is a pro. Honestly, there are very, very many on the market, and you can kind of trick them out as much as your heart desires. But the basic concept of how the filter works is that they essentially use pressure in a very, very, very small filter with very, very small spaces in it that pushes water through, and the only thing that makes it through these tiny little spaces is an actual H2O water molecule. Everything else, for the most part, does not go through this filter, right? They are one of the filters that remove some of the most contaminants from water. They do, as like a con, not treat a ton of water at a time, and they do tend to waste water as well because it takes a lot to push that water through the filter. So they're a great option, but they're, again, those pros and cons. One of the pros is that they're flexible in cost. just given the high number of them on the market and their popularity, so they're much more accessible. Let's see how many options available. They remove some of the most contaminants out of any filtering system. Con is that they treat a small amount of water at a time. My parents have one at home actually, and the water pressure's not great on it, so you'll sit there filling up a glass for a little while, but it's really, in the grand scheme of things, pretty minor minor drawback. The taste is another drawback that people sometimes have. There are a lot of things in water that are beneficial to our health and that make water taste good, like calcium and magnesium. They're really good for contributing to water taste. Things like that, though, will get removed in a reverse osmosis system, so some people don't like the taste as much. A nice kind of get around for that is that there are systems available that you can add on, like a remineralization, like cartridge, where they'll add the beneficial minerals back into the water, so then you get around like that kind of bland taste that you get from drinking just the filtered water. And then I would say this is the biggest drawback to the system is that pre-treatment is often recommended. If you have, say, like hard water at home, RO systems, as they're called for short, can be prone to spoiling. I don't think that's supposed to happen. Um, so we don't want that to happen because if it has like a lot of mineral or scale buildup in a system, it's not going to work as effectively. So generally pre-treatment is recommended, and that may vary depending on the system type. And then of course, as every water treatment system has, there is some maintenance, so you will have to periodically replace filters and things like that, which most people can do themselves. A lot of plumbers do install treatment systems without low. What do I do? See if I'll just keep going because I know what I'm talking about. A lot of plumbers will install RO systems, but if you feel like pretty savvy and comfortable, there are a lot of systems you can install yourself. So the installation, as well as the actual availability of them, is more flexible as well, which I would say is another big pro. Moving on to another type, probably the second most common for nitrate removal is anion exchange. And if you're looking at this picture and you have a water softener at home, you might say that looks exactly the same. And it's because the concept is almost exactly the same. We essentially have a tank with resin, like a resin bed in it, but instead of the resin wanting to remove calcium and magnesium, which are positively charged ions, the resin is geared to remove negatively charged ions. And as we saw earlier, nitrate is NO3 with a little negative sign up top. That means it's a negatively charged ion. So these resin beds typically use chloride, which is another negative ion, and essentially exchange chloride for nitrate. So whereas, say, a water softener takes out things like calcium and magnesium, puts sodium back into the water, this takes out nitrate, puts chloride in, which is one of the cons. But they work very well at removing nitrate because they are considered a point of entry system. They treat larger volumes of water. And again, let's go back to, we don't need to treat water for like bathing and laundry and things like that. But if you wanted something that's going to treat much higher volumes of water, even just for drinking and cooking, an anion exchange system would do that. But one of the drawbacks is that larger system, a little bit more involved to install, so the cost tends to be a little bit higher. I would definitely recommend having a professional install one if you get one. Maintenance costs are, probably going to work out to be pretty similar to a reverse osmosis system. Maintenance with these is more frequent because you have to potentially like refresh and replace the resin that's actually removing the nitrate, and how often that happens may depend on how high your nitrate is. So that's more of a consistent maintenance that you would have to do for this system, whereas an RO system, you would have to change filters less, but those filters are a little bit more expensive. So the maintenance costs probably end up evening out for these systems. But the initial cost for this can be a little bit higher. So yeah, it treats large amounts of water, requires professional installation. They also, like a water softener, other systems typically do require more space as well, just due to their size. And when they're back flushing the water, they are going to need a drain to drain into. So that's why systems like this work best in like a utility room or basement where there is a drain. There are taste considerations for this as well. In some cases, if a lot of chloride is being added, so if this system has to take out a lot of nitrate, that means there's going to be more chloride added back into your water. That can sometimes cause like a salty taste. So if there was a large amount of chloride, there'd be a little bit of a taste drawback, but that's one of the drawbacks. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's just one of the possible ones. The last treatment type I'll talk about today is distillation. So distillation is exactly what it sounds like if you know anything about distilling or anything like that. It essentially boils the water, to the point where it becomes vapor, but then that vapor is condensed into pure drinking water. So actually one of the options, if you were to buy one of these, I was trying to find like a good picture of one. Some of them are just like a brewer's or home brew type, or if you like were making liquor at home, like those type of distilling equipment, it's the same concept generally. But there are some that are geared towards water treatment, and this is an example of those. So these, of course, are point of use. If you had a whole home distillation system, I don't even know if they'd exist. It would be massively expensive and intricate and a whole thing. So these are point of use only. There's a wide range of costs for these as well. Some of these little guys are about like 100 to a few hundred from what I've seen, but there are some that are like $60. There are some that are 100, so wider range of cost, but typically on the low end for these. So they are a bit more cost effective. They do remove almost all contaminants, right? Because essentially, like I talked about with boiling water, nitrates left behind, same concept here. The remnants from the water that was boiled stay in the water if there's any left, or just are left behind as like salts or things that you can't see because they were dissolved in small amounts. And then the condensed water is purified. The drawback to this, besides the fact that, as you can see here, because this is about the size of a coffee pot, this doesn't treat a lot of water at once, so that's definitely a drawback. And then the other drawback is that there are certain compounds, like volatile organic compounds would be one. So those are those like nasty smells when you smell gasoline or like ethanol and things. Those have a lower boiling point than water. So things like that would volatilize or go into vapor before water would boil. So that would be kind of not removed in this process. So that's a drawback. Not everybody has those compounds or things like that in their water, but that is something to be aware of, is that it removes a lot, but it doesn't remove everything, which gets into why there's so many different substances in water, because it is such a great solvent, but that's why we need multiple treatment technologies to remove different things. But works very well at removing nitrate.
And this is essentially like the distilled water you can buy at the grocery store, right?
I would think it's pretty much the same. I'm assuming that's just what they mean by distilled, is that they distilled it, but I've not really checked. But the technology would be the same if they were distilling it versus distilling here. The distillation process is still the same. Yeah.
A question on the ANSI 62, so that's a certain level of certification that's needed that indicates it's okay for nitrate? Is that what that means?
It is essentially, so they do it, it's kind of confusing. They certify different types of systems. So this system, like NSF ANSI 62, is for distillation home treatment systems. So they verify like the materials and the contaminant reduction claims. They don't do it like per contaminant. And so like this NSF ANSI 58, that's for a reverse osmosis system. And then 53 and 42 are for ion exchange filters, but more just, these are a little bit more general as far as I know, like water treatment certifications for homes. So one of them is for like health contaminants, and another is for like aesthetic things. So it covers both, which is why I still recommend using the search feature, because there's a lot of different certifications, because you want to make sure you're getting something that's certified in its contaminant claims, not just that the materials are safe. You want to do both, but you want to make sure it's not like one or the other. So I just have some general recommended next steps here. These also do go beyond just nitrate, but as someone who works in groundwater and water testing, I still feel obligated to tell you these good tips. So it is recommended to test your well annually for nitrate, of course, as well as for coliform bacteria. Those are two great checkups on a well that are good to do every year. If you did have levels that were like approaching 10 or in those middling ranges, as I spoke about earlier, definitely consider testing annually for nitrate. If you had 5 or above, then consider something like a pesticide screen. And then left field, if you have never checked for arsenic or manganese, consider checking for those at least once. Just want to put that out there. And some resources. I'll also talk about the lab and like actual testing logistics if you have questions on that. But I just want to plug our center, so the Center for Watershed Science and Education, as well as the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey and UW Extension's Natural Resources Institute, recently collaborated to put together a free self-paced guide that walks through a lot of the things we all are talking about today in like bite-sized kind of like course-like information that talks about groundwater in Wisconsin, aquifers, many different contaminants, well construction, how wells work, testing, and then interpreting results and treating water all in one place. And it's, again, it's free, it's self-paced, but it's a really, really great resource because there's a lot to this. So I just wanted to share that. And then in terms of like water testing, the county is a great resource for the nitrate screens, as well as if you have questions about where to go to test. The Water and Environmental Analysis Lab, where I am located, does do nitrate testing. We are a state certified lab for nitrate, as well as many other of the contaminants I just discussed on the last slide and even beyond that. And you can order a sample online. We've got a website that I did not link, so I can provide that later if you'd like. But you can order a test kit to be mailed to your house. You can collect a sample and mail it back in for nitrate. Most labs, not just our lab, it's about $30 to do a nitrate test. And results come typically in a few weeks. The DNR, which I'll show on the next slide, also has a web page that lists all of the Wisconsin state certified labs, which would be recommended to go to for these like standardized test methods in a lab. So screens are always great, but when you're like, oh, okay, I want to go to a lab, go to a state certified lab. So the wheel is, we're called for short, is one, but there are also many others. So I encourage you to check out this list from the DNR and find one that's the most accessible for you to use for testing, because it is good to go to a certified lab. Because like certified products, certified labs have been evaluated and adhere to high standards. So 2 more resources to go through before I'm all done, but one of these is the Wisconsin Well Water Quality Viewer, which is exactly what this picture is here. We've actually since updated it a little bit, but our center has aggregated all of our private well samples for the state of Wisconsin spatially, so we can view generalized water quality for different areas in Wisconsin. Everything is anonymous. You can't like say, I want to see what my neighbor's well is. You can't find any specific wells information to protect people's privacy, but it's a great tool for getting an idea of general water quality in your area, not only for nitrate, but for different kinds of metals, for hardness, pH. So I encourage you to check that out. It's a really fun tool. And then the lower QR code, lower link is the Wisconsin DNR's resources for private well owners. So that includes their well construction like database where you can look up your address and try and find your well construction report, as well as resources like a list of state certified labs. So they have a ton of resources as well that I recommend you check out.
Question, I wanted to make sure I plugged that, the University of Stevens Point Water Lab. Every time we've been promoting that for years now and giving out bottle kits for you to use, that data goes in there. And, you know, that has been an incredible resource for counties that, some counties don't have any staff, you know, and all that. They can at least go to the water viewer and look at all of those contaminants. And they can say, well, you know, it doesn't look like X is a problem in our county. I'm gonna work on this. And I'll work on something that's identified. So that has just been fantastic.
Thank you, thank you. We're glad to hear that. That's what we want it to be, is a tool for everyone to make things more accessible. That's all I have. I'm pretty sure I did go over, so I apologize, but I will take questions now if we have any. Yes, sir.
The RO system take up
If it has a carbon filter cartridge on it, which some do and some don't, it would take out some PFAS compounds. Carbon filters work pretty well for PFAS due to like the PFAS have a lot of carbon in them and they're very like big molecules and they adhere to things that have carbon in them. So a reverse osmosis filter, I think just by function, wouldn't allow a PFAS compound to pull through, but typically the recommended filter for a compound of like PFAS's origin is a carbon filter, as that chemically is more likely to stick to PFAS.
one more. Are irrigation wells deep enough not to affect a regular well?
It depends. Yeah, I mean, I'm not as familiar with nitrate concentrations in irrigation wells. I know that they are tested, and it's good to do that, but it all just kind of comes down to that area and the geology. If it's like an irrigation well drilled into a bunch of thick sandy soil and there's a private well nearby drilled into the same material, if that aquifer has been like saturated with nitrate, they might be a little different, but I can't say for sure like if the irrigation well is going to be completely fine compared to a private well. Like odds are it'd be lower just given the depth, but that isn't always the case, and a lot of that just depends on the geology.
irrigation well just take out a cone of water from the aquifer that might have gone to the regular well?
They can, yeah. If they are drawn to that point, they can create a cone of depression. But that also depends a little bit on the water use around that and availability in the region. But that is something that those high capacity wells can do. Yes.
Specific question. I've repeatedly had my daughter's private well tested, 8.5, 8.5, put in an RO system. Would you recommend that we also test for bacteria at this point? I understand that maybe a correlation between nitrates and bacteria.
I wouldn't say correlation. They're both great tests to do annually because they can be indicators of different things. The main concern with bacteria is that a properly constructed well should not have bacteria in it. So essentially, a properly constructed well should be providing sanitary water. So if there was bacteria in a well, it's indicative that there's some type of pathway that bacteria is getting into your well. So it's not necessarily associated with like human influence. There are isolated cases based on geology, like Door and Kewaunee counties, not to put too much on them, have a lot of geology called karst, and that there's karst in the western part of Wisconsin too, but they have this really susceptible geology where there are a ton of cracks and fractures in the ground, and they also have like hardly any topsoil. So if there was like, say, a manure spill, they would be more likely to have bacteria in the water and probably nitrate too, but that's not typically the norm. It's a very like specific case of not a lot of topsoil and then very specific geology as well that's essentially like interconnected caves in some cases. So generally they're both good to do, but if you have nitrate, you're not more likely to have bacteria, and if you have bacteria, you're not more likely to have nitrate. So both are good, but not necessarily interrelated. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Can you comment on any of the new pollutants that we might be concerned about given the large-scale solar projects being planned? Also, given the karst and sinkhole situation we have in St. Clair County?
I wouldn't be the most informed to comment on that specifically when it comes to solar farms. I'd defer to Tim and other like local experts on that. I will say it is generally good though to have an idea of your current water quality and get an idea of what that is consistently so that you can identify any changes over time.
So there is a database that's been collecting samples from the state. For how long does that go back?
The database I mentioned, we have data going back to the 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, can you go specific, like a watershed? Like I'm in the Rush River watershed.
Yeah.
Can you get details from like just that?
You can.
Just to establish a benchmark of where we were, say, 10 years ago and where we are now. I mean, is that data available to come up with some kind of a conclusion?
So yes and no. And I want to say yes because you can for that area. If you were to go into that tool I mentioned, you can find like the Rush River watershed and you can select by like I think we have like we go by larger watersheds, so I don't know if we could do one that small for like the Rush River, but you can do like a custom area that you select, like you can draw a shape over the whole Rush River watershed and you could get a statistical summary of all of the data we have for that area. But the thing that we can't do, and this goes back into how Patty was talking about the study design of like the nitrate study, is that the data in that area is great for providing a general overview of the water quality in the region, but if we want to look at trends over time, we need to have a more specific design where we're sampling the same points repeatedly. So in the case of like Rush River, if we had a lot of data from like the 80s, 90s, it's probably from a wide variety of wells that are constructed differently, potentially pulling from different aquifer systems. So it wouldn't be rigorous enough to say if there was a change over time. So it's like we can see where it's at now, get an overall idea, but if you wanted to go back, it would be hard to draw any conclusions. So we don't typically have like time on the map because it could lead to a lot of like conclusions being drawn that might not be accurate just based on the number of samples and how they were collected. Yeah, so sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where do you get that information? Is that from the Wisconsin Well Water Quality Bureau, or where is that information?
Like in terms of like, yeah, that would be from the Wisconsin Well Water Quality Viewer that you could find that area and say, oh, I want to see a general summary of what's the pH in this area, for example, and you could get a good idea of the average pH. Yes. Yeah, I'd Google like UWSP well water quality viewer, which is a mouthful, but thankfully there's a lot of W's in there. And we're usually the first link. You might have scrolled down a little bit. And then you can click on the map, and I'd recommend like trying a few things to play around with it, or you can give us a call and we can walk you through on how to use it, because there's a few different tools that you can use on it. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
A few spots where it's, I guess we call it a karst feature or a sinkhole, where maybe the spring runoff or after heavy rain, water flows and then it's heading down to toward the aquifer.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the rate of travel? It's heading down. Is it the sponge or is it the underground railroad? Is that going to, I mean, it varies at different parts of the county.
Yeah, yeah.
Like say you're a quarter mile away from where you see this happen. Is that affecting me or somebody else?
It's hard to say without knowing more. Yeah, water is going to move very quickly into that fracture, but then it's like, where does it go then? Like, are there more interconnected fractures, or is it maybe shifting into a little sandstone, or is it dolomite that isn't cracked, which is going to be a little bit slower? So it's really hard to say. That is pretty close. So again, it's good to test your water repeatedly. And if there's like an event, like a spill or a massive storm, and if you ever notice like a change in the color, odor, or taste of your water, test it, because that could be a sign that it was being influenced. That would be a big sign. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, so it's hard to say. It would be good to get a sense of like your well construction as well and your water quality to see if your well is being impacted at all. Because if you have a really deep well, really deep casing, and your nitrate's low, it's really unlikely that that spot would be affecting your well. But if your well is more shallow and does have higher nitrate, it'd be more likely that it is. Yeah. Yes. Mm-hmm. I know that there are some available, but I'm just not familiar with the process of how they're developed and how they're evaluated, so I can't really speak to it.
All right, I got my stick out. Yeah, I'm last speaker. I'm Tim, and I did have a football reference tackling nitrates, but since the Packers got knocked out early, we probably should skip that anyway, I guess. We have a lot of wells in St. Croix County. There's a lot of reasons for that. We have about 17,700 wells. There's probably more than that. There's people have probably just dug wells for their own use for like yards and that kind of thing that are not registered. But we have about 17,700 wells in the county. That serves about half the population of our county, which is close to 46,000 people on rural residential private wells, where all the stuff we talked about applies, the testing. You're responsible for the well, that water that comes out of that well. You have people that live with you. You're it. There's nobody going to come around and tell you what to do with that well. So that's kind of one of the main things I hope you take away, is that you're kind of in control of that. We have so many wells. We have we're kind of a bedroom community. We've done a lot of development, and in a lot of areas where there's more strict zoning, they've excluded a lot of people from living in rural areas, and that's reduced the amount of people that are exposed when you have these kind of issues that we're talking about. But the problem exists that we have that many people that live in rural areas, so that's what we have to deal with. Whoops. Basically, other than the northwest corner of the county, everybody pretty much is getting their well out of limestone. The biggest producer is Prairie du Chien, which is a karst feature. And we've studied that a lot, and I've got data on that we'll show you. Municipalities, Roberts, Hammond, Hudson, they drill deep. They go down into that sandstone that has a lot slower rate of travel, and they get clean water because it hasn't gotten down there yet. Everybody else is up here. And so,
Can you read us?
oh, I mean, you're probably talking in the range of 200 to 300 feet to get to that sandstone aquifer. And so pretty much everybody else, if you want private water, you're going to be in that top layer, which is a karst feature. So there's a lot of mixing. And so this has been one of the things that we've had. The county helped support with USGS. We helped organize it. 2 big studies of groundwater in our county in the 1980s and 90s. And then again in 2009, we worked with USGS to study groundwater, and what they found, they did a lot of work on flow direction. They did a lot of source determination of that water. They did a lot of work on basic chemistry, a lot of basic work. They also determined that we had a lot of water in our county. So that led to a lot of development because you can sink a well fairly economically. I know it costs a lot of money, but there's a lot of places in the world that I have lived that you're going to be going, $40,000 or $50,000 just to get the well in, because you have to go 400 or 500 feet. And we have pretty accessible water, and it's pretty good water and a good water supply. So they learned a lot of things about the aquifer, and that was kind of the basis for the development and that's happened since. One of the key things is that shallow aquifer. It's coming from here. That shallow water is not coming from Lake Superior or coming from some other land with dinosaurs. It's what fell here. That's something you have to remember. 96% of the water that we're taking out of those wells it fell on our county and went through our soil and is now in that shallow aquifer. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That water fell on our land over time. So we started a program. We started to see problems. As far as 1999, they began to work with residents. I think we did it by town, and we cost shared the cost of doing a sample at UW Stevens Point, and we collected a lot of data, and it was so much fun. They did it for 20 years. Once you get something going in government, it just keeps going. So for 20 years, they did that. But there was a need. We promoted sampling. We identified some hot spots. It was a good public service. People got to sample their wells, and I think people learned a lot. Then along about 2016, 17, we had a big major manure spill in the county, and residents were quite angry about it. They formed a study group, and they really put together an incredible plan for what they wanted. Well, it turned out to be Land and Water, who I was hired to run that in 2019. They wanted us to figure out more than just sample more samples from the county like we had done for 20 years. They wanted to know how bad it really was, the extent, the trends, the sources, not just general, like, hey, we know it's from all these things. They want to know where it really was coming from. And then they wanted to be more active in this education. And they wanted to, once we learned these things, they wanted to take that to actually apply what we had learned. And so what I'm going to talk about today is really implementing that mandate that they gave us. First of all, extent of the problem. Remember, 15%, this is just from 2025 data, but it's good, reliable, good data. If you do the math on that, there's about 6,900 residents that have wells serving their homes that's over 10 parts per million. I think we're about number 3 in the state for the number of residents that are exposed. And the reason for that is a lot of counties have way more people than we do, but they have them in cities where they drill deeper wells. We have them out in the county. And so we have a large number. We have about the same number of people that have real clean water, less than a part per million, than we have water that's over 10. So we have a lot of people. What's the biggest probably thing that's of a concern to me is look at the number of people that are kind of in that range of the 5 to 10. If that moves up here, we really do have a problem, bigger problem. Right away, when I started implementing the plan, I knew that there would probably be cut before 10 years. I'll just be honest with you. Public does not generally have a lot of patience. And, if you talk to the university people, their patience is a day as long. They'll study something for 15 years. Public officials are not. And they have a lot of competing needs. So I knew we needed to figure out this trend first. And so we looked at wells that had been sampled every year. It's called TNC wells, the transient non-community wells. And we had 165 of them in the county. We went to those and got that data. It had been sitting there getting put in the file every year. Nobody ever did the trend. That was kind of an easy plum to pick. And we found out about 39% had no trend. About 31% were increasing statistically like that. And then we had the no change and the decreasing trend. We had 12% decreasing. And I looked at every one of those on aerial maps, and the 12% decreasing were largely on the west side of the county in areas that had been in agriculture, but then they developed and ag went away and they started to go down. So pretty much all of those 12% were in that. Then we had to figure out the sources, and that's right where you start to get into the politics. So when it comes to regulating nitrate, it's been great. Nitrate is a great product to put on your crops because it grows great crops. And you're not going to get regulated because you can blame it on septic. And the septic guys aren't going to get anything because they'll blame it on agriculture. And the agriculture guys are going to blame the golf course. And the golf course guy is going to blame manure because that guy's just out there trying to make a living, has a couple cows. And so it's been finger pointing for many, many, many years in this arena. And so we needed to do more work on that. And we did do more work on that. We could have saved ourselves a lot of work, but basically the main agencies, Wisconsin Groundwater Coordinating Council is just a group that does a report to Congress every 2 years, and they consult DNR and USGS and the extension and all these folks, the big hitters that don't really have a money to make or anything. And that basically the conclusion is 90% of the nitrate is from agriculture. And 1% is from lawn and 9% from other things like septic. That's kind of been in those reports that not many people read, but the last 8 that I pulled up had that exact same thing. I'm doing some work in the Kinnickinnick headwaters area where we did a nitrogen balance sheet calculation where we determined it very similar to that. This is one of the more intensive farmed areas of the county, and it turned out to be about 92% was from agriculture and about 8% from septic and lawn. But that area is not the whole county. If I did the whole county, it would probably be a little bit more favorable to agriculture. We were tasked with coming up with a plan to fix that area or help that area. And so that's why we studied just that area and found results very similar to what the state's been saying for 10 years. So I knew everybody'd be dozing off by the end, so I came up with something more fun. So I came up with kind of a hypothetical. So I got 2 wells. I got well A and well B, and these neighbors, they talk. I mean, you can't keep anything a secret in rural rural county areas. And one of those guys has got a high nitrate and the other one's really low. So they came walking in and they want me to tell them why. And I was like, okay, how would I approach that with these people? And we have this happen. So look at the well depth. Well depth is really kind of common thing to look at. A lot of times the shallower wells are higher. And so this well A is 71 feet and well B is 121. Not that deep in our area. And then they've got various, you can look at the well logs and so you know that the topsoil in this area is sand and gravel and it's clay and sand mix over here. And the bottom geology and all that is in that well log. So based on some of that work we've done that Patty demonstrated, we've sorted that CGMP database, and we know if you've got limestone, that's your highest. That's where you're going to get your highest nitrates. So we can look at that right away and know, well, this is going to be our, we got to look at that geology. We have data from our county that shows that that's probably our biggest problem. And then you look at what's above that, what's leading down to it. And, limestone with sand and gravel over the top of it, that could be a problem. That's our highest nitrates in the whole county. So we can look at those things and start to decide, hey, what do we have in those? Next, we'd look at land cover. What's around your well? Probably within sight of your house is where your nitrates are coming. We did various analyses to figure that out with varying sizes of circles around the well and then looking at correlations. And half mile probably does most of it. So around this well, we have a wetland area. You can look at some of the different types. We have open water. We have a little bit of row crops. And well B is mostly, it does have that little bit of forested area, but it's mostly crops. And also we can determine well direction. Don't call me with short notice and ask me to get well direction because it takes a lot of time. So how you do that is you look at all the wells that you have in the area and you look at the elevation. So if you've got lower, that's the direction. So, but you have to do a lot of searching for well logs and to get the static well level, and then you can determine direction. We can look at the USGS maps, but they're pretty gross, and you can't, always decide which direction is really going. So next we look at the crop types, and it turns out that corn is one of the most important things that we have to look at. And we have crop layers that are available that you can look at how many years that field has been in corn. It was so important, it made its own layer. We did the statistics on that, and we found out that the frequency, the more times that corn is grown consecutively on a piece of ground, the higher the nitrates. So that's a very important factor in our area for whether or not you're going to have high nitrates. So what do we have? Take that layer and put it on our little map. You've got a high amount of corn. So if you have 14 years, this particular map was 14 years old. So 7 years would be a corn bean rotation every other year, right? So this particular well has a high level of corn, almost continuous corn. This area, much less. Corn beans, probably. That's why it has 7 in it. So if you look at corn frequency in proximity to the well, it explains a lot. Means there's rotation or not. Well A is 3.7 and well B is 13.8. Because of some of those things we talked about, it has the geology that's more susceptible. It has the cropland. Doesn't have a lot of natural area. I have wells that are in a flow direction on the opposite side of a natural area, and they're clean as ever, and their neighbors that they can see on the other side are high. just do that, the same exact scenario. Then you have to look at also other factors is how is that well constructed? And a lot of times you buy a house and you don't have a lot of control, but if you're drilling a new well, you can influence this. So most common is you drill the well down to the bedrock and case it down to bedrock. That works most of the time, but in a karst feature, you can still, there's so many cracks in that karst that you're drawing water just as if you hadn't even had it cased. If you don't even go down to bedrock, you're essentially taking it off the top of that feature. That's probably the worst situation. The smarter money cases into the bedrock. That way you're drawing from that lower layer. And that can be a big factor. Whenever we have a real high well, we usually look, and a lot of times they've cased it down to the bedrock, but not into it. It's a big factor. What have we done for education and informing? We've done a lot of troubleshooting like we just talked about. If we went to replace all those wells, it'd cost us $21 million. I think that's probably 3 or 4 years old now, so we could probably add a few million to that. That'd be replacing all the wells over 10. So we've got a lot of wells over 10. It's going to cost a lot of money if we were going to do that. The DNR has a fund for that, 10 million for the whole state. so if you really think you're going to get into that, you could play the lottery at the same time and get in on that. So we've been doing a lot of screening clinics to educate. If we promoted treatment, now if we went to treat all our wells over 10 and we said, hey, we'll help you with that, that would be just those little single tap ones, which remember, there's a few drawbacks to those. That'd be $3 to $4 million. If we did whole home systems, it'd be 14 million at least. We can't really buy our way out of this. This is what I'm coming to. I want to pivot to how do I best explain how do we got here? So the nitrate level in your well relates to that load that's around your well. And the water came from here, didn't come from the dinosaurs. So when they start going into the dinosaurs, you gotta step up and say, it's not from the dinosaurs. So I've had people try to tell me that. Okay, so 1 part per million is about 1.6 pounds of nitrogen lost every year. Then you could see that could happen in a natural system. The higher your well, so when you get up to 10 parts per million, you're losing only about 18 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. That doesn't sound like too much because these guys are putting on a lot of nitrogen. But it works out. I'll show you. So we have leaching estimates for all this stuff. A lot of good data, more studies than you can possibly read. I've read them all, so you don't have to. Basically, how you grow your corn, how you grow beans, whether you use a cover crop or not, whether you rotate, that all has values that you can research, and there could even more research could be done, I'm sure. We took all that data and we applied it to what we have. So we know how many acres of corn we have. We know how many acres of continuous corn we have. We know how many acres of soybeans we have. We know all of that because of the incredible technology that we have today in the GIS systems that are out there. So we built a model and we were able to test this stuff out to see what would happen. So if you have continuous corn and you lose that much nitrate, all the wells would be 27.5 parts per million. But we don't grow crops on every acre, right? And so then you have to factor it in. If it's only on 75%, it would only be 20. If you went to a rotation, just a regular old corn and bean rotation, it would be 12.8, but it would be less than 10 if it wasn't wall to wall. So you don't have to take it down very much to start to see where we get the values that we have now. If you go to a longer rotation, the traditional old-fashioned couple of years of row crops and then go to alfalfa, now you're down into very low levels. Just that rotation is so powerful, but it's hard to get people to do that. Cover crops are really popular now. If you go, just put cover crops in with soybeans and go to a corn and soybeans, you're down below 10. Even if the 75% of the landscape is corn and soybean. And very few areas are that high. Most of them is about 50% at the very highest. If you did cover crops on corn and soybeans, now you're really tackling a lot of that load. You're removing it. Manure is a hot topic anywhere that you propose a new big dairy or something. Our average application rate is about 19,300 pounds. I got that by looking through all of the nutrient management plans, so you didn't have to. 10,000 gallons of slurry is about the highest you'll ever find in a university publication. So if you find one that's higher than that, you let me know. We're applying a lot of manure. Lowering that would help. It would help because you would also not build up phosphorus, which is what we're also seeing in those soils. Now, if we ask people to lower the rates, they're going to have to find new fields to put it on, and it's going to cost more money. They also probably have to use a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer when they're growing their corn because they won't be able to meet all the needs of their corn. So it's not like we can just come up with these ideas and it's just going to happen. Another thing that we're working quite a bit on is improving the nitrogen fertilizer efficiency on corn, which is our biggest thing we're working on is corn. Trying to do some of these basic agronomic things that we've kind of known a lot about, but we need to try to get more of it. And in the farmers that worked with me last year, I had 21 fields. The top 8 yielding fields had an efficiency that was very good, and there was very little leaching. And so I know that the farmers we have in our county can do these things. So I'm very confident that they can do these things, and on a larger scale is what we needed.
And when you say
Yeah.
efficiency, what does that mean?
So you would think, normally people would think 1 pound of nitrogen per unit of bushel yield. So if they think 200 bushels, I got to have 200 pounds of nitrogen. We have our farmers in our program are getting 0.6, 0.7 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per unit yield. So they're well below 1. And when you run those fields through the leaching estimator, you don't get any leaching. So we know that, but we've done it on fields where we actually had them keep track of everything, and they came back with applying 130, 140 pounds of nitrogen, and they've got 200 bushel yields. So the ratio is favorable. So we're going to try to promote these things. We have another grant this year to do that, and we'll keep going and keep promoting it. We put some of these BMPs into the model that we've developed for the headwaters of the Kinney, because that's an area where we're really working. I did the baseline. The baseline is what actually is there. So we have a whole Huck 12 that's almost over 10 as an average. That's our area that's the worst. Just to the east of it is the Baldwin Rush River aquifer area. That average is 4.7. It's just so much less. There's only 6% of the wells over 10, and it's because of the soils. And so we included the whole area because we wanted to have that area included. Anyway, we were able to calculate and build a model we have 619 samples from that area, from groundwater. So we use that to calculate load, and then we built a model using those leaching estimates. And then we applied our BMPs, and we were able to lower those nitrate levels in that area, which if we could lower it, that'd be great. Right now, we have statistical data to show that it's increasing. We need to stop the increase, and then we got to start going down. So we're trying to tackle that. And the way we're going to do it is through how I mentioned. So I hope that provides a little bit insight of what we've been working on for addressing. Yeah.
If you have, and I missed,
Mhm.
I'm sure you said it somewhere. If you have a top layer that's got clay in it.
Yeah.
Most clay based, and then you have below that the limestone, is that associated with higher?
Generally, it's a lower nitrate levels, but yeah, the clay in our area tends to crack. Every few years, you'll get incredible cracking where it acts just like a karst feature. And it hasn't been that way for the last 3 years, but I've been told by, Tammy, who used to work here, she was very knowledgeable about all this stuff. She observed that when they had real dry years, that's when you'll get your brownwater events because of that whole Baldwin Emerald area has high clay soils. They'll crack, and now when you get runoff, it goes right in the cracks. And so you have a period of time. It takes a long time for that to re-swell, a lot longer than you'd like it. And so you have a vulnerable situation in that regard. Yeah. Anytime you have weather changes and things of that nature, you don't really know for sure what's going to happen. Yeah.
Said BMP, what's BMP?
Best management practices. Yeah. All the things that we tested in our plan that we're coming up with for the Kinney, I should point out, none of it is stuff that's not been proven 150 times, right? So best management practices means it's been tested by the university many, many times. It's been adopted in various, people have done it. It works. It may cost more money to the farmer sometimes. So that's why we go cost share or other promotion ways to promote it. But when we talk about best management practice, it's not like what we want. It's what's been shown to be the best. Yeah, proven.
Follow up, you gave an example,
Mm-hmm.
working with you, someone could apply a whole lot less
Mm-hmm.
nitrogen. And we extrapolate from that, assume that that saved the crop production.
I believe so. That was one of the reasons I'm doing some summary of that. This year's the second year, and I'll have like 40 fields when I get done, but I'd like to even do more. It'll evolve. I think some of the people are very excited they couldn't believe how much corn they grew without, with the lower amounts. And so it's a risky business cutting your fertilizer, and so I'm sensitive to that, but we think there's the tools available to do it safely. And that's kind of what we're promoting. Yeah.
Can you get a good enough argument to convince these farmers not to grow continuous corn?
I don't know. I've been arguing with that. My brother was a Pioneer seed dealer for many years. And when we had lockdown dragouts, we got put outside a couple times. Yeah, I mean, he was all about corn. You couldn't have more, more corn is good. Even more corn is better. And that's where we usually get tackling and throwing pillows and stuff. But continuous corn is definitely a problem. What happens is the soil fundamentally changes over time to where when you put fertilizer on a field that's been in continuous corn, it's rapidly converted to nitrate because what happens when you rotate is real complicated in the soil, but it does a lot of good things. It keeps the soil microbes off balance so they don't, if you're feeding them the steady same thing every year, what happens is they'll adapt to that and they'll actually convert it to nitrate faster. You also have a large buildup of organic materials in a continuous corn system that's hard to deal with too. So they they apply higher rates to try to deal with that. So it's still a viable system for a lot of folks, but it definitely is not, considered like a soil health type of a practice by any means. Yeah.
Make as much money doing a rotation?
I think that they can, but haven't seen really good economics on that because you definitely have to apply a lot more inputs. If there's something that affects corn,
that was reported anywhere on the earth, you're going to perk up and apply something to prevent whatever that was. If you have rotation and you only half your ground is in corn, you're not going to panic as much because you've got rotation on your side that breaks these cycles. If you have a continuous crop, you're going to be susceptible to anything corn related. So I think in the long run, I think it's a better, more economical practice to throw in rotation. But I mean, guys are looking at, hey, I got to survive another couple years, and so they just hammer away. So, but yeah.
So with the K-poles we have in the area,
Mhm.
Just trying to put this into perspective. You know, they plant corn,
Mhm.
corn every year after year. And you know, so if they keep applying the same amount of manure to the general area, so they're not absorbing all the nitrates that's created year after year. And does that keep building up then by doing that? I guess I want to.
The nitrate doesn't build up. The phosphorus builds up, and we have soil tests on it to show that that's what's happening. So when you try to use manure as a nitrogen source, you're going to over apply phosphorus as a routine measure. And so all you have to do is look at somebody's soil test, and if they're getting higher and higher, you know that's what they're doing. The biggest problem with using manure for a corn fertilizer is that it generally, if you use enough, it will mineralize late in the fall. We've been having these late falls. You'll get a big slug of nitrate release in the fall when there's absolutely nothing to take it up. And then it's there all winter long. So it's vulnerable. You know, if you had $10,000 to put fertilizer on your crop, you wouldn't put it on last fall and just let it sit out there and hope it doesn't rain. You know, you would say, I'm going to put it on right when it needs to go on, because I'm not spending another 10,000. And so in the case of manure, it's very difficult to get that volume out the door due to weather considerations, right? And so they locked into a fall or a spring, and they really like the fall. And so it puts a lot of manure in the ground, subsurface application, it's great. But if we get one of these late falls, it's above 50 degrees and it can mineralize and it's vulnerable. And so a lot of that could go into the organic pool too. It's great for soil organic matter, but a good chunk of it does vulnerable to leaching. So yeah.
Doesn't it have a lot to do with why all this excessive phosphorus buildup is creating algal blooms in the lakes and streams and rivers?
Well, yeah, phosphorus is a known problem, and it's been a problem for a long time. Doesn't take but a couple tenths of a part per million of phosphorus in the water, and you can have algae blooms, right? And so the more you have in the soil, the more is runoff if you get water runoff of the field. So, yeah.
Isn't there quite a bit of a number of farmers that are planting corn for ethanol?
Good point. It's about 40% of our corn is ethanol production. Yeah. So yeah, that was always one of my dream laws, you know, that I would pass when I given the scepter would be if you can produce ethanol from almost anything, but corn is excellent for doing that. But if you used one of the perennials, there'd be no leaching from that. It would have to be done. I mean, that would have to be some sort of a mandate that they would do that, because you don't get as much ethanol from those sources as you do from corn.
Yeah, so what's the first step for states throwing in the room here that's, say, a farmer themselves, potentially they're running from ground out.
Yeah.
They want to spread the good word about the BMPs that are potential for the folks in the ground.
I mean, if they want to learn more about the BMPs and have confidence about what's available and what would work for them, we have conservation staff here. Evan's one of them. Josh is available, and others. who can do like a walkover, a field walkover, just try to, talk, figure out what could be done. What are you doing now? Everybody's at some point in the spectrum. What are you doing now? And, maybe there's no room to improve, but maybe there is. Almost everybody has something that they could improve, whether it's for runoff or for groundwater. Generally, there's something, people can improve. So the first step is to get information about, what's available. Like our programs change every year, just about what we have, where we have money to do it, what we have money for, all that kind of stuff. But we do have technical assistance. We can always provide that, and happy to dispense it. So, any other questions?
I just have an observation. I'm
Mhm.
surprised that, you know, I worked construction when I was working, and, when a new idea came along or a new procedure or a new method, everybody, oh, you could make more money doing it over here, over here. So, we moved out here, we've been out here like 20 years, 25 years now, and it's like, the farmers are all doing things differently, and I'm going like, how can that be right? How can they
Mhm.
all be making money? And I get it, there's different ways to do things, I understand.
Mhm.
But in most things, it's like the people, they find out what's the best way to do this.
Mhm.
And here, they're not doing it that way.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with a lot of the ground that we have in the county is rented, and people take that rented ground and they're trying to farm a lot of land. And so then it becomes a matter of in and out, right? Versus if you were doing it the best way you knew how and on 200 acres, you would probably do a lot better. But to make money, maybe the 6,000 acre person is probably making more money just on efficiency. So I think that might explain a lot of it. And it's easy to add bells and whistles, but not easy to add bells and whistles on 3,000 acres. So yeah. Anything else? Yeah. Thank you for coming.